seemed to favor new federalism and block grants. But George W. Bush seemed to push back towards regulated federalism with laws like No Child Left Behind and the creation of the Department of Security. It's pretty safe to say that we're going to continue to live under a regime of cooperative federalism with a healthy dose of regulation thrown in. But many Americans feel that the national government is too big and expensive and not what the framers wanted. If history is any guide, a system of dual federalism with most of the government in the hands of the states is probably not going to happen. For some reason, it's really difficult to convince institutions to give up powers once they've got them. I'm never giving up this power. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studio. Work for Crash Course U.S. Government comes from...
Okay, so... There we go. All right, you guys. Just a reminder, Eric is handing out... There we go. Phone class. This is your class, just a reminder, all right? As a reminder, this is how you get into the book. Right here, okay? These are the weeks. We are in, shockingly, somebody's absent. We're shockingly in week 4. I'm not even sure how that's happening. Here we are in week 4. So, Workbook Chapter 5 is due on Friday, okay, right, it's right there. And I'll stick it with the assignment too. I've noticed that some of them are stuck in there and some of them are not. Here are the questions over what we're going to talk about today, and then here is the lecture. So, downloading it really quickly. Which you can do, or you can look out on your computer. I mean, why take up that space? It's already there for you. Eric is handing out voter registration forms. If you want to fill one out, you can. One of the things we're talking about with federalism is you have to register to vote in whatever state you live in. States regulate elections, which is weird because we've had some things happen since states started doing that. And see, it happened again. Oh, heck. Sorry, this happened in my last class too. The problem is I can't. Wait, that's down. Hold on a second, guys.
If you have an Oklahoma registration, voter registration, you can turn it in to me and I can turn it in for you. That way you can save you a stamp. If you got the Texas one, you have to mail it into your certain county. So Oklahoma, you can turn it. Since we're killing time, everybody knew you had something to do on Friday, right? Last Friday, thesis. Any questions? Yeah.
Those are all bonus.
Correct. 5 bonus points for turning it in on time. Pretty good. And you get feedback on your essay.
All right.
Ready to rock and roll.
Sorry guys, it's the second time that's happened to me today. So I've downloaded it and it's come up with blank slides. So we talked about federalism last Wednesday, and we talked about the 5 steps to federal supremacy. And those of you that were present, you'll recall that that's a potential essay question, and so you should pay attention to it. So I also asked you what you thought the most important step to federal supremacy was. 39% of you are going to say Civil War and 14th Amendment. 24% are going to say the Constitution itself. Modern civil rights is going to tie for second at 24%. And then the New Deal at 13%. but only 122 of you answered that poll, which makes me think maybe there were some technical difficulties, but maybe also by that time you had tuned out. As a note, when we have class on Zoom, there's a spreadsheet that shows when you come into class and when you leave the class, and it sends me a report. Just a note. All right. So, federalism as defined, right? It's a way to share power between a national government and regional governments, in our case, states. Constitution grants power to both the state and national government that cannot infringe upon each other, okay? A unitary form of government is different, right? This is the first question in your set of questions. What's the difference between them, right? People give, and here's the sum. People give power to states, and people give power to the federal government in a federal style. In a unitary style, people give power to the unitary, and all other power comes from the unitary government. In a confederation, people give power to the states, or the provinces, or cantons, or what have you, and the cantons, or provinces, or states give power to the federal government. Make sense? Yeah, okay. So, we talked about the fact that there had been a power shift over time, from state power to federal power. This is because of expansion of federal interests and expectations, but then it's also because states lack the sophistication to keep with the times. They lack the revenue, they didn't have the money to do it, and, not here, but it should be noted, didn't have the political will, okay? They didn't have the political will to expand in the same way. Supreme Court is the final arbiter between state power and federal power. That is significant. We're going to talk about some key cases in just a minute. Those are my 5 steps. Just a reminder, they're in the last set of slides where I explain each one of them, but we have that set of steps. The necessary and proper clause, the commerce clause, the supremacy clause, the 14th Amendment all contribute to growing power. The 10th Amendment has been used to protect state powers, especially recently. But I want to pause there for just a second. What does the 10th Amendment say? No, not quite. No, not quite. 10th Amendment. Yes. No, not quite. The 10th Amendment, oh, over here, yeah, guys.
Is that power is not granted to the federal government, to the state government?
That's right. And the people, respectively. So, any power that is not granted to the federal government is reserved to the states and the people, respectively. And so what that means is this, okay? The federal government gets explicit grants of power. Anything that is not explicitly granted to do, or implied to be able to do, anything that's not its power, the states have that power. So if they don't talk about it, who has the power? States. And if states don't do anything about it, who has the power? People, right? Okay? So we see a lot of power, for example, we'll talk a little bit about this, but for example, in Oklahoma, we have something called home rule. Home rule. And home rule means that cities, okay, can decide for themselves what their regulations are going to be. Seems like a pretty good deal, right? Can you guys think of lately recent examples where cities have made laws where the state has not? Yes. COVID regulations is a perfect example of that, okay? When states declined to make COVID regulations, then local municipalities made those regulations instead. For example, the city of Norman did what? Created a mask mandate, right? Oklahoma City also created a mask mandate. Hey guys, do you need masks? Because this is the mask section. So, for sure, will you? Thank you. So, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Norman, a number of cities across Oklahoma, because the state did not create any regulations, created their own regulations. Okay? So for the first year of COVID, that's what happened. But when the legislature went back into session, what did the Oklahoma legislature do? Anybody know? Anybody know?
Say you can't require a mask.
Yeah. You go ahead and say it. Okay. You made a finable offense if towns and towns and schools and cities enforce masks, right? So, for example, in this classroom, with the exception of emergency policies, I cannot enforce a mask mandate. Now I can say, hey, look, over here, I have students who prefer to wear masks and feel comfortable and want to feel comfortable in that way here, and so they're going to sit in these locations, and that's for their protection. But there has to be a space for people to also sit, right? And so the governor made it so that local governments did not have that power any longer. Instead, it has to be an executive order from the governor, as the legislature passes. The governor has the power to make an executive order to put in vaccine mandates or mask mandates or any of those things. Another example of this would be about 3 years ago. 3 years ago, the city of Norman had on its agenda at a city council meeting that it was going to vote on whether or not to require you to pay a 5-cent tax per plastic bag that you use. Why were they considering this? Why is this a thing they were considering?
Government overreach.
Anyone? Yeah. What? The environment, right? They said, what do you guys do with plastic bags that you get at grocery stores?
Reuse them.
You reuse them as trash bags sometimes. What else do you do? Throw them away. The vast majority of them, I throw them away, right? The vast majority of them get thrown in the trash, okay? Or they get reused as bathroom trash bags, or in the case of my dog's poop bag, right? But they still end up in the trash, right? That's where they go. And so the question is that the best thing to do? And many cities and states have discussed this policy, and Norman, because this wasn't a rule established by the state of Oklahoma, said, you know what? In our community, we think this is a good idea. That week, the legislature went into session and passed a law forbidding municipalities from requiring a tax on bags, taking that power away from local government. They can do that, okay? Because states have the power first, then the people, okay? 10th Amendment. But something important about the 10th Amendment is this. The 10th Amendment is often used by people to say, oh, the federal government doesn't have the power. I don't see that power anywhere in the Constitution. But they refuse to look at anything past what? Any guesses? The 10th Amendment. Because starting with the 13th Amendment, what does the federal government start doing when they pass, how do you pass a constitutional resolution? A constitutional amendment, sorry? 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states. That's a lot. Okay? So to pass a constitutional amendment, that's what you have to do. And when you join into the Union, you're signing on to the Constitution. Okay? So the 13th Amendment specifically does what? Outlaws slavery and indentured servitude. What does the 14th Amendment do? All sorts of things, actually. It says people are citizens.
Equal protection.
And they get certain rights, and states can't abrogate those rights. Equal protection of the laws. Crazy things like that. Okay? The 15th Amendment, what does it do? Come on, you know. That's the 16th Amendment. 16th Amendment is taxes. Voting, right? all men can vote over the age of 21. Okay? The 19th Amendment, I'll give you a hint, it's voting again. Who gets to vote then? Women. The 26th Amendment, who gets to vote? 18 and older. Under each one of these, it says the federal government has what? The power to enforce it. Which means, do states really have power over voting? Well, yeah. They've had it, but should the federal government choose to regulate voting across and make it uniform across all the states? Could they do that?
What would it take to make that happen?
I think it would take political will
Well, that,
to make that happen.
but like a piece of legislation.
Particularly like a Voting Rights Act, right? We passed several of those, okay? But the question is this, does the federal government have the power to do it? Yes, without question. Without question. A lot of people point to the 10th Amendment and say, no, state power. Not anymore. Not with the passage of the 15th Amendment. Okay, so it's been a while, 150-ish years. Okay, so greater financial resources are also used to advance the national government. States want people to settle there, and so they lower taxes, which means they don't have revenues. And as I pointed out in that slide on Wednesday, what's the average amount that states get from the federal government? Like a third of their revenue. A third of their revenue comes from the federal government. Can states operate without money from the federal government? No. It's not a question of what do they cut, it's a question of what doesn't get cut. So, power sharing is a source of contention, particularly if one state is in a partisan lean one direction and the power in the federal government is in a different direction. So, Marshall and this is a video, I don't have time to show you, because I showed you the one at the beginning of the crash course, but you can click on it. It's Marshall's view of federalism. Who is Marshall again? Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, the very first true Chief Justice and the last Federalist with power. There's some key court cases that we know about. Marbury versus Madison, which we'll talk more about when we get to the judiciary, which essentially says the Supreme Court gets to make the decisions about what's constitutional and unconstitutional in some. Gibbons versus Ogden and McCulloch versus Maryland, we talked about on Wednesday. And then there are a ton of New Deal and civil rights cases using the 14th Amendment and using the Commerce Clause to expand the power of the federal government in policymaking at the local level. The Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah. Segregation in hotels specifically. They said, we are a private business. We're a private business in Atlanta. We're not a private business in Atlanta and Knoxville. Therefore, it's not interstate commerce. Supreme Court said, no, the thing is people travel to your hotel, so you can't segregate. That's commerce and it's related. Okay? So we have a number of cases like that are desegregation, and we're going to talk much more about desegregation in 2 weeks. But then we see a turn back in the 1990s. Garcia versus San Antonio Metropolitan Transit Authority is specifically a case that's really interesting. In the early 1990s, Congress passed the first gun control law that hadn't been written by the NRA. The NRA wrote the gun control laws before that. But the NRA kind of changed leadership and changed direction. Okay? In the early 1990s, Congress passed a law that for the first time was not written or agreed to by the NRA. You guys know what that was? Do you know why we wrote it? Because President Reagan had been attempted to be assassinated. And it's called the Brady Bill, right? And the Brady Bill specifically said you had to do things like have a background check before you could have a gun, buy a gun. And there had to be a waiting period while that background check went through. Okay? Because John Hinckley had done what? What? Tried to kill Reagan, but he specifically is, he's pretty crazy. I mean, he thought he was doing this to impress Jodie Foster. Okay? So he walked in, he bought a gun, and then he went and shot the president and several people around him, including Brady. Right? His wife Sarah Brady, because he had brain damage for the rest of his life, really championed this bill in Congress. So the Brady Bill passes. And one of the things about the Brady Bill that is included is a part that says this. It says, also, we're going to control guns around schools. They throw it in there, right? We're going to say, they're going to make actually this is a gun-free school zone act, and it's an addendum to the Brady Bill. And they say, this is related to commerce. How is education related to commerce? Because they've been making this case for a while and giving money to education. So how is education related to commerce? You tell me. Yeah, right? We're educating our workforce. Okay, we want an educated workforce. We have, for example, we've already related it to national security with the Defense and Education Act in the 1950s. Why did we pass that law? Cold War, beat the Russians, make the moon first, make space first, but we didn't, make the moon first, which we did. Okay? National security, commerce is an easier reach, frankly, right? So they pass this, they say it's completely within our powers to pass this and to outlaw guns around schools. So Garcia is arrested, and he said, and the lawyer says, hey, this is not legitimate. It's not a legitimate law. It's not a legitimate constitutional power. And the Supreme Court agrees. They say that guns are not related and education are not related to commerce. It's weird because they have a lot of education acts that work. Okay. So they slip back a little bit. And then in Prince versus United States, going back to the Brady Bill, it was required for a period of time that sheriffs had to do the background checks until the national system was up. Sheriff said, you can't order us to do anything. We are local state officials. We have our own sovereignty. And the Supreme Court agreed. They said, you cannot order state officials to do anything. And then what happened? Any guesses? September 11th, Patriot Act, Homeland Security. We order state officers to do whatever we want at the federal level at this point. Right? And nobody says anything. Why? What's the difference? Is there a difference? Yeah.
They're afraid of being anti-patriotic.
Afraid of being anti-patriotic. Right? Sure. Also, gun rights are involved. So, we have devolution of public policy. In the 1980s and 90s in particular, we see a particular period of time where a lot of power is given back to the states to determine how to run things like welfare policies, how to run things like education policies, how to run lots of things that the federal government had been handling and paying for. The state said, no, that's our power, that's our power, that's our power. And finally, the federal government said, okay, we agree. It's your power. We're going to give it back to you. And the state said, where was our money on that? They said, it's your power. You come up with the money. States did not like that. They thought, maybe this isn't what we want, but we're going to pretend it's what we want. Okay? Unfunded mandates, there are two really key ones here. One is the American with Disabilities Act, passed in 1991. States hated this act, okay? Because they had to do what? They had to provide.
They had to build a bunch of ramps.
The first thing everybody says, and you're exactly right. That's what they were mad about. They were mad about building ramps. I practiced law in the state of Oklahoma, and I went to a lot of small county courthouses that you still access by going down the very rickety, sometimes they have a railing. Two-ply board ramp, right? I mean, done. We've done it, right? This passed in 1991. You realize it's been 30 years. And so people were mad about that, but people are also mad about other things, right? The ADRC. That's the ADA saying, hey, look, just because you process slower, or because, you have some way that is different of learning information, or you need to see things in a different way, or you need to hear things in a different way, or not at all, but get that information in a different way, doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to go to college or public schools. States hated it. Second thing they hated were OSHA regulations. OSHA regulations, do you guys know what that is? Yeah?
Safety regulations for workers.
Safety regulations for workers.
Can't stand on a chair.
You can't sit on a chair. But also steps. Steps have to be a certain level. Were any of you ever in the football stadium before they fixed the stairs? I mean, like 2 years ago, because that's when they did it. I know, because my seats are up against the wall on the bottom level. they're super, the angle's super bad, number one. But then you go halfway up and the steps are at the right, they put in steps at the right level, and they have now fixed it, okay, everywhere across the stadium. But after a while though, you had to take these giant steps like this to get to the next one, and I am short. It is a hard thing to do, and it's high, and it goes like this, right? States hated that. How do you deal with that? It takes money, right? Unfunded mandates. Unfunded mandates. States share power and continue to share power with the federal government on many important policies. But there are some things the federal government requires, and again, Real ID is another example. Real ID law was passed with the Patriot Act. Okay? With the Patriot Act, 2002. It's 2022. How many of you have your Real ID? I'm going to go with maybe half. Okay? Maybe half. So, national police power has been an increase in, and this is something, again, in the 1990s, the Supreme Court said specifically they could not do, but terrorism, people are not pushing back against it, so national police power has increased. Moral issues and family law is a place where we see a lot more place for the federal government, in particular in the area of same-sex marriage and adoption and inheritance, okay, and rights to be in a hospital room, okay? Because imagine you spend your life with somebody and they're dying of cancer and you're not allowed to even walk in because you're not next of kin, right? So in this area, states said that's morality, we get to regulate that. The Supreme Court said, no, that's equality. That's equality. So they took a step into family law. Education, like I said, it began in the 1950s, the space race, the Cold War. In the 1960s, we see people saying, oh, it shouldn't just be math and science, maybe we also care about people being able to read and speak and think. And it doesn't really have a massive change again until there's a really strong, and mainly, understand in 1965, there's some strings, this is Cooperative Federalism with some strings, but not many. Okay, the Secondary Education Act. In 2001, when we passed No Child Left Behind, it is all strings. How many of of you went to school, and there might be like one or two of you who went to school and had to do any testing under No Child Left Behind? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a few, okay? What happened was in the 5th grade, the 8th grade, and the 11th grade, you had to take tests, and you had to pass them. And so that entire year, what happened was you were taught what? What were you taught? What was on the test? How to take a standardized test. What was on the test? And it was memorization. I taught in the former Soviet Union right after the fall. And one class of students, or I had a class of students, and half of that class of students went to a private school where they had done a lot of critical thinking. And I went to another one that was a Soviet school, and they memorized whole swaths of information that they could regurgitate like that. It was amazing. But they couldn't think. They couldn't think. The other problem, of course, with No Child Left Behind is everybody had to cook the books in order to stay afloat. Because if you didn't pass, if enough students didn't pass, what happened? You lost funding. They just took it away. So you have students who aren't passing, you're in crisis, so we're just going to remove your funding. That makes a lot of sense. All right, so economic bailouts, we had an economic bailout in 2009. We also had a pretty big one over the last couple of years because of what? COVID, right? You got individual checks, but so did states. And,
ARPA funds.
ARPA funds, yes. So, but they were told what to do with them. So here's some consequences. States are going to compete, as federalism generally, states are going to compete for resources like business and jobs. So they're going to take away resources from citizens sometimes, giving big tax breaks to corporations to come in. They're going to build roads and infrastructure around business centers, such as Oklahoma City did what? Built up a downtown area. They paid for a Bass Pro Shop that they have down here. They target certain infrastructures. NFL stadiums, for example. St. Louis is very sad about losing their NFL franchise, but every single analysis of that says, good for you, St. Louis, because it was killing you. All right? Because there are some cities that can support it and some that can't. And you had to build the stadium yourself. Railroads, for years, bankrupted cities and states because you had to pay for it to get them there, and they were private companies. Bass Pro Shops, they've got an excellent racket. There's an Oklahoma City council member who said that the worst vote he ever made was to vote to build a Bass Pro Shop in Oklahoma City. Said the rest of it, he said, I felt good about the MAPS program, but that was dumb. As a result of that, states are going to limit their aid to the needy and to their people. Because they're going to focus on this business instead. They're going to have to compete. He talked about dual federalism. Again, remember, federal power, state power, it's layered. This is what you pay for. This is what you're in charge of. This is what you pay for. This is what you're in charge of. Two distinct layers. They don't mix. Okay? Cooperative federalism, also known as marble cake, it's all mixed up. All right? Hey, states, why don't you take care of this federal thing? We'll give you some money for it, but hey, we're also going to pay for this thing that's normally a state thing. But you have to do these certain things and follow these certain policies if you do it. The Great Depression, the New Deal is the main reason for that. You have the federal government identifying problems and then the states implementing it. We have centralized federalism, which is a lot like cooperative federalism, frankly, except for it has more strings, right? The federal government had been giving money to states, and states were going, thank you so much for the money, now we're just going to do what we want. The federal government said, hey, we had a plan, we gave you the money, now you have to do what we want. States got very angry and said, states' rights. They elected Ronald Reagan, they got new federalism as a result. Devolution, targeted block grants. The state said, wait a second. You said we wanted the power. You didn't say we wanted to pay for it. So my question for you is, which is the best? Which is the best?